So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the arguments for and against the attempts to prove God's existence. Remember, we were discussing the differences between traditional Christianity and Christian existentialism as a way of understanding how the virtues work. And we're answering the question, how is God connected to the world? Does he show himself to us, or is he alienated from us? Does he manifest himself to us only as an absence? So traditional Christianity is going to say that God shows himself to us in such a way that we're capable of using natural reason to prove God's existence. Whereas Christian existentialism, following most Protestant religions, would say that we can't prove God's existence using human reason. Original sin has darkened our reason so much that we can't achieve that conclusion. We can believe in God only through faith as a result of grace. So in traditional Christianity, that believes that you can prove God's existence using reason, there are two different traditions of using reason to prove God's existence. There's a Platonic tradition using the mind in St. Augustine and St. Anselm. And there's an Aristotelian tradition using the senses in St. Thomas Aquinas. So the Platonic tradition is going to use what are called a priori proofs. A priori is just a word that means prior to the senses, resting on the mind. And St. Anselm gives his famous ontological argument. And the Aristotelian tradition is represented mainly by St. Thomas Aquinas, and he uses an empirical, a sensory, or a posteriori proof. A posteriori proof is just a Latin phrase that means posterior to or after the senses, based upon the senses. So the five ways of St. Thomas are the a posteriori proofs of God's existence in the Catholic or the traditional Christian tradition. Remember, the idea is that faith is still subjective commitment of the will made independently of reason. So the reason that you would believe wouldn't be because of these proofs. They're a supplement to faith, not a substitute for faith. So you wouldn't get faith by proving the existence of God. The traditional statement of that is the motto of our college, the statement by St. Anselm, that faith is in search of understanding. You have faith first, and you use understanding to expand or to supplement it. The existentialist view is going to be that we can't prove God's existence. We're so cut off from God that we can believe only through that leap of faith. So the proofs that we're going to look at all involve two sets of crucial issues. First is going to be, where did the universe come from? Is science adequate to explain where the universe came from? Or do you need to bring in something else? Do you need to bring in a supernatural cause? And the second crucial issue is going to have to do with whether a different type of existence, a necessary and eternal existence, is possible. So this little table summarizes the arguments for and against the existence of God that we're going to be looking at. And they boil down to three different causes, three different possible ways the universe could have come into existence. The first way is that it could not have come into existence. It could have just always been there. It could have been around forever. We'll call that the infinite regress possibility. And we'll see St. Thomas arguing against that and David Hume arguing for it. Another possibility, if the universe doesn't go on forever, it started somewhere. It started from some first event before which there was nothing. We'll call that the something from nothing possibility. The argument for that is going to be the Big Bang theory in physics and the quantum mechanics, of a branch of physics, which has been used to support that idea. And St. Thomas will argue against that possibility. We'll see that St. Thomas tries to rule out these two possibilities. These are two non-God possibilities. These are two scientific ways of explaining the universe. St. Thomas tries to rule those out, and by process of elimination prove that the only possible source of the universe is this different type of being, an eternal and necessary being. We'll see that St. Anselm arrives at that same conclusion from a different route, using the a priori method of using the mind and the concept of God to get to the same conclusion. And David Hume will provide an argument against the possibility of an eternal and necessary being. So, St. Thomas's arguments are all what are called transcendental arguments. They start with some fact of existence, and in these proofs, the fact of existence is going to be very obvious, just that things exist. And then is going to try to show how, if you make that assumption, you're led to a contradiction, you're led to a failure. And then that shows the limitations of science. They start out as scientific or objective proofs. They pose some scientific principle and then attempt to explain this fact of existence using this scientific principle. They reach a failure, and then that shows that you have to assume or prove or posit the existence of something outside of reason or outside of science. This transcendental method of proof is important for us, apart from just the existence of God, because it's the first argument we've looked at that is an argument against Plato's principle. Remember, Plato's principle was that the definition of reality is objectivity. St. Thomas's proof attempt to show that reason itself, or science itself, will discover its own limits, and will discover that you have to believe in something outside of science, outside of objectivity, or outside of nature, some supernatural cause of the universe. We're going to be combining St. Thomas's first two ways. There's a little technical difference between them, but for our purposes it doesn't matter. We'll combine both of them together and call them the proof from existence. And they're working to explain how things exist, and they're using the scientific principle that everything has a cause and nothing is the cause of itself. So there's a famous story based upon that principle that explains sort of the type of situation that we're imagining if everything in nature has a cause and nothing is the cause of itself. Just in the same way, if you ask, if your child asks you, where did they come from? You could say, well, you came from mommy and daddy. If they ask where mommy and daddy came from, you could say, well, they came from grandma and grandpa, and then they came from their mom and dad, and they came from their mom and dad. And you can see very quickly that if everybody has a mom and dad, and every mom and dad came from another mom and dad, you can keep going back forever. There's a famous story that's been retold many times in the history of philosophy, attributed to many people. I think its original version, at least in Western philosophy, is in John Locke, the English philosopher of the 17th century who influenced the founding fathers. And he tells the story of an Englishman who goes to India and asks the great Brahmin, the great wise man, what is it that holds up the earth? And the Brahmin says, that's easy. The earth rests upon the shoulders of a great elephant that supports it on its broad shoulders. And he says, that's interesting, but what holds up the elephant? And there he says, well, the elephant is held up by a turtle, which holds up the elephant, which supports the earth on its broad shoulders. But then he asks, yeah, but what holds up the turtle that holds up the earth, that holds up the elephant, that holds up the earth? And the Brahmin just says, well, under the first turtle, there's a second turtle, which holds the turtle up, which holds up the elephant, which supports the world on its broad shoulders. And now the guy starts to get a little bit exasperated and says, yeah, but what holds up the turtle, the second turtle? And there the Brahmin just laughs and says, Sahib, it's no use. After that, it's just turtles all the way down. So the idea is that there might be an infinite regress of things holding up things that support the earth. And of course, the infinite regress in this case is that something must have created you, and something must have created the thing that created you, and something must have created the thing that created the thing that created you. And if there were no original cause, then it would be an infinite regress. It would be turtles all the way down. But St. Thomas thinks that he can prove that an infinite regress is impossible, and the heart of this argument is these two arguments, these two sub-arguments that attempt to prove that an infinite series can't be completed. The first argument has to do with the nature of the past. There couldn't be an infinite number of days before today because the past is, by definition, complete. The past is what has already happened. All the days before today have already happened and they're finished. But an infinite series can't be completed. If we started counting to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we would never get to infinity. Literally, that's what infinite means, without finis, without ending. If the past were infinite, if there were infinite number of days before today, we would have never have finished getting to today because an infinite number of days, by definition, can't be completed. So that's the first argument that St. Thomas gives, that there must be a beginning. There must be a first uncaused cause. It couldn't be turtles all the way down. Somewhere those turtles have to be standing on something, which is not yet held up by anything else. Again, note that the conclusion ends up with an exception or a violation of the assumption that it made. You may remember this type of proof from high school geometry, a reductio ad absurdum proof. But remember, it starts out trying to explain things scientifically and is led by this failure to posit an exception to that scientific rule. So God is the exception to the rule that everything has a cause and nothing causes itself, because God has to be the first uncaused cause. You may want to note that at this point we haven't really proven that it's a personal God or that it's a Christian God as opposed to other gods. We've just proven that it's a first uncaused cause, like Aristotle's unmoved mover. The 5 ways of St. Thomas, we'll see, work together to add more and more to our concept of God until you finally get something like a designing or personal God in the 4th and the 5th ways of St. Thomas. But that's just the first version of St. Thomas's argument that an infinite regress is impossible. He also argues that if there is no original cause, the entire series is without a cause. If we imagine that something has to hold these things up, and without something holding it up, they'd all be falling down, then if there were no solid ground, then no matter how many turtles we stacked underneath these turtles, the whole bunch of them would still be falling. Or consider this example. If I wrote you a check and you went to cash it, and they gave you another check, and you went to cash that check, and they gave you another check, and you went to cash that check, and they gave you another check. If it was checks all the way down, your check would be completely worthless. Somewhere along the line, there has to be some cold, hard cash, or else the entire series is without value. So again, St. Thomas says, unless there were a first uncaused cause, then the entire series wouldn't exist because there wouldn't have been a cause to get it started. So Thomas thinks that an infinite regress is impossible, and he thinks he's ruled that possibility out by these 2 different types of arguments. Now, most modern physicists would agree with St. Thomas on that. The majority of physicists believe that the universe is not infinite in age. It hasn't always been here. It began about 13 to 14 billion years ago in what was called the Big Bang. St. Thomas, of course, didn't know about Big Bang theory that arose in the 70s from evidence of a background radiation detected by radio telescopes. But St. Thomas did conceive of the possibility that someone might say that that first uncaused cause, the beginning of the universe, wasn't God, but was just another natural physical event. So the 3rd way of St. Thomas tries to prove or answer the possibility of the Big Bang and suggests that whatever started the universe, it couldn't be just a physical event like the Big Bang, that the universe required some supernatural cause like God. And it's called the proof from possibility and necessity. So it's trying to disprove the possibility of the Big Bang or a first natural event as the beginning of the universe. It starts with the same fact that things exist, but now its scientific principle is that all natural things are contingent. They have a beginning in time and an end in time. Contingent means you depend upon something else. And if you depend upon something else, then you'll have a beginning in time when the thing you depend upon brought you into existence. And you can have an end in time when something takes you out of existence, or the things that you depend upon cease producing you or cease supporting your existence. My dad used to tell me, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. That's an example of a contingent thing. If you depend upon something else, then you'll have a beginning in time, and that means you'll also have an ending in time. So if that's true, then if this is me, and we trace back what came before me, there'll be a beginning to me, and there'll be a beginning to this, and there's a beginning to that, and a beginning to this, and everything will have a beginning and end. And we've already seen it can't go back to infinity, so if we go back far enough, we'll reach the Big Bang, the first event. And before that, there will be nothing. So if all natural things are contingent, then at one time there was nothing. But St. Thomas thinks that this is impossible, because if at one time there was nothing, then there would still be nothing now, since nothing can come from nothing. The famous Latin phrase was ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. Sometimes this is called the principle of sufficient reason, because it says in order for something to happen, there must be a sufficient reason for it being so and not otherwise, and for it happening at this time and not another time. So St. Thomas says if at one time there was nothing, then all nothing could do would just sit there and be nothing, because there would be no reason, nothing to bring the Big Bang out of existence, and nothing to bring it out of existence 13 million years ago rather than 20 million years ago or 30 million years ago. So nothingness would provide no sufficient reason to bring anything into existence, and nothing would still be existing. So if there's a world, then there couldn't be a time when there was nothing. So the principle of sufficient reason says you can't get something from nothing. So just as every child could see to ask, where did the Big Bang come from, if it's supposed to be the beginning thing? St. Thomas says that the existence of something that doesn't have a reason or doesn't have something that it came from is impossible if it's a natural thing. But instead, St. Thomas says you have to posit something that violates that scientific principle, another exception, just as we had to posit an exception to the rule that everything has a cause to get a beginning to the series, so it wasn't an infinite regress. So we have to posit an exception to the rule that everything is contingent, and we have to believe in a different type of reality, a necessary and eternal being. Necessary means it contains its own cause, so you can't ask what caused it. You can ask what caused the Big Bang and where did it come from, because it's just a natural physical event. But God contains his own cause. That's what necessary means. And therefore you can't ask what caused it. And it also is eternal, which means it exists outside of time. There isn't a before and after it. You can't ask what came before it. Whereas the Big Bang, which is an event in time about 13.5 billion years ago, is an event in time, and we can ask what came before it. So St. Thomas thinks that you have to posit the existence of this weird type of being, a necessary and eternal being, where you can't ask where it came from because it came from itself, and you can't ask what came before it because it exists outside of time. St. Anselm arrives at that same weird type of being, a necessary and eternal being, but from a different root. Remember, the word ontos is being, so St. Anselm's ontological argument tries to deduce God's existence just from the concept of God, from your idea of the being or the essence or the ontos of God. And he starts with the common ground that he thinks even an atheist agrees with, that the definition of God is the best possible being. Anselm's statement is usually translated by the awkward phrase, God is a being greater than which none can be conceived, which just means that he's the best possible thing. He has to be thought of as having all perfections. So if God's the best possible thing, then the atheist who thinks that that's the right definition of God, but there just doesn't exist anything that meets that definition, it's not a real thing. Anselm thinks that's a contradiction, because if existence is a perfection, and God has to have all perfections, that God must have existence, and God must exist. We'll see that this is the first version of the argument, because there's an objection that Anselm considered when he published the ontological argument in his work called the Proslogion. He considers the objection of a monk named Guanillon. He tries to say that there's something wrong with this argument because you can use it to prove the existence of anything. His example is a perfect island, or the best conceivable island. If it's the best conceivable island and existence is a perfection, then it must possess existence, so the perfect island must exist. I think the objection works a little bit better if you imagine something that you know doesn't exist. So let's imagine a perfect 10-ton statue of President Favazza, and imagine it's made out of chocolate. So let's imagine a 10-ton chocolate statue of President Favazza that's greater than which none can be conceived, the best possible one. So if it's the best possible one, then we would know that it had to have existence if existence is a perfection. Yet I think we're pretty sure that no one has created a 10-ton chocolate replica of President Favazza. So we can see that there's something fishy with that argument. That's why St. Anselm came up with the second version of the ontological argument, because instead of saying that existence is a perfection, St. Anselm is going to say it's necessary, and eternal existence is a perfection. It's better to exist and contain your own cause than it is to be caused by something else and to be a contingent thing. So God must be conceived of as existing necessarily and eternally. That's part of the very definition of God. And it's this last part that actually proves God's existence. In the case of a contingent thing, like the 10-ton chocolate replica, you don't know whether it's existing. You can't know it exists just by thinking about it. Because it's contingent, something had to bring it into existence. So we'd have to check and see, has someone actually taken 10 tons of chocolate and molded it into a nice replica of President Favazza? And even if that were the case, we still wouldn't know whether it still existed. We wouldn't know whether it had melted away or whether it had been eaten by a horde of hungry freshmen. And it could have been destroyed in many ways. So for contingent objects, we have to check to see whether they exist. But a necessary being, because it contains its own cause, doesn't need anything to bring it into existence, and nothing could possibly take it out of existence, because it doesn't depend upon anything, and it exists outside of time. So St. Anselm thinks a necessary and eternal being would just have to exist. You don't have to check with your senses to see if it exists. It's part of the definition of that thing, that it exists necessarily. So part of the moral of this story, at least according to an existentialist, would be that perhaps your head hurts right now after considering those arguments. And the difficulty is that the idea of infinity, the idea of necessary and eternal existence, the idea of something from nothing, might go beyond the ability of human reason to understand. So St. Anselm's argument, or rather St. Thomas's argument, really is saying which of these three possibilities hurts your head the least. He thinks he can rule out an infinite regress and getting something from nothing as impossible. And he thinks that assuming this weird type of existence, that's an exception to the rules, that you don't have to say where it came from, and you don't have to say what came before it, this necessary and eternal existence, makes more sense than assuming an infinite regress or something from nothing. So let's look at some of the arguments against these proofs for the existence of God. And we'll go in the same order, for an objection corresponding to each of the three possibilities. an infinite regress, something from nothing, and a necessary being. So a scientist would say perhaps the universe could be infinite. A scientist would say it is possible to get something from nothing. And David Hume is going to say that a necessary being is impossible. So not only does it not exist, it's impossible that anything exists that meet the definition of God. So Hume gives a famous argument that it's possible to have an infinite regress, a response to St. Thomas's argument. His common ground is that if you had a regiment of soldiers, then as long as each member of the regiment has a cause, say a mother, you don't need an additional cause for the entire regiment. You don't need an additional mother in addition to the mother of each of the soldiers. You don't need a mother to give rise to the entire regiment. That would be painful. So the argument here is that an infinite regress of causes is possible. As long as each element of the series has a cause, you don't need an additional cause for that series. So Hume is sort of saying, if we go back to our turtles, maybe you're imagining, little turtle toes dangling in midair with nothing holding them up. And if that were the case, then they would be falling. But note, that's not what an infinite regress is. Every single turtle is held up by another turtle. And if that's true for every single turtle extending infinitely, then you don't need an additional cause, additional solid ground holding up the whole infinite series of turtles. Each of the elements has a cause, so you don't need an additional cause for that entire series. In the same way, modern mathematics disagrees with St. Thomas's other argument that an infinite series can't be completed. We'll see one of the common themes of the scientific responses to these proofs of St. Thomas is the idea that reality goes beyond the ability of the human mind to comprehend it, and that there can be more things in this world, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, as Shakespeare says in Hamlet. So the mathematician thinks that even though the human mind can't conceive of a completed infinity, mathematicians deal all the time with infinite sets of numbers. And the entire field of calculus is based upon the ability of the human mind to calculate things by imagining that we infinitely subdivide a region into smaller and smaller subdivisions. So mathematicians think that you could have an infinite set, and that just because you can't imagine it, just because your mind gets into contradictions when you start to try to imagine an infinite set, doesn't mean that it isn't possible that an infinite set couldn't be completed, that the past really could be infinite. So as I said, some physicists believe that the universe is infinite, and that the Big Bang that happened 13 billion years ago wasn't the first one, and that the universe, if it has enough mass, will stop expanding and start contracting again until it gets to a big crunch, and then there'll be another Big Bang, and that series of Big Bang, big crunches will just continue for all infinity, like a rubber band stretching and contracting. Recent evidence has suggested that the universe is not slowing down in its expansion, is in fact expanding more quickly. Not a lot of physicists believe that, but there are some who do believe that the universe is infinite in extent. The second objection is going to come from a branch of physics called quantum mechanics, which deals with the movements, the mechanics of very, very small particles. So this is the model of an atom that you're most used to. It's called the Bohr model of an atom, with a central nucleus and electrons whizzing around it. And it turns out that was only believed to be true for a very small number of years, from maybe between 1910 and 1925. Every physicist after 1925 knew that it was false, including Niels Bohr, who became one of the founders of the next model, the quantum mechanical model. You may know that now in your chemistry books or your physics book, you see a model like this, where the electron is represented as a particular shaped cloud. But of course we know it's not a cloud, because clouds are composed of little tiny particles. So we're going to see that just as the argument from infinity suggested that reality is stranger than we can imagine, so it's going to turn out that the rules that govern these very, very tiny particles are stranger than we can imagine. Niels Bohr is famous for having said, not only does quantum mechanics say that reality is stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. And that anybody who thinks they understand quantum mechanics doesn't really understand quantum mechanics. And it may be useful just to see why the rules that govern little particles are so different than the rules that govern our common sense. Because that's going to be the argument, is that our common sense is that something can't come from nothing. But our common sense doesn't apply to this other realm of little tiny particles that are so much smaller than us that it's hard to imagine. So we're about 4 times 10 to the 28th time bigger, heavier than a proton, and about 4 times 10 to the 14 times larger. If you were a proton, the electron would be about the size of a pea, and it would be about 13 miles away, maybe in Nashua or up in Concord, out in Auburn, over in Ware somewhere. And it would exert a very powerful electrical attraction on you, a much weaker gravitational attraction. Just to compare, if you were the sun, the entire solar system would fit into this smaller circle. The Earth would be where Dana Center was, and Jupiter would be at Cumbes, and even Pluto would fit into the Manchester area. So there's much more space in an atom than there is proportionally in the solar system. So this little video tells you how our common sense doesn't apply to atoms, because we don't actually touch atoms at all. There's more space in them. What keeps us from going through them is the electrical forces involved. So quantum mechanics is based upon what happened when we first tried to track what was happening to the electron. We first observe it, say, popping into existence, say, 20 miles south of us down in Nashua. Then we might next observe it popping into existence 20 miles north of us. It's called quantum mechanics because it didn't appear to move continuously in the spaces between. It appeared to just pop in out of existence here and then pop out into existence over here. In fact, if we set up a wall that it couldn't get through, it would exhibit a phenomena called quantum tunneling, where it would just pop out of existence and pop into existence over here, unaffected by the barrier. So then it would pop into existence over here, and then maybe pop into existence out to the east, and continue just popping in and out of existence at various different places. Eventually, it would continue popping in and out of existence in this particular pattern, and this is the cloud that you see representing the electron. Again, it's not actually in all these places broken up like droplets of water in a cloud. It's more like, this is the place where, on a target. You have to pause for a second while this portion of the video uploads. So each of those little dots is a place where the electron is popped in and out of existence. And what quantum mechanics discovered was that there was no sufficient reason that would predict exactly where the electron would end up. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle said that it's impossible to know exactly where and how the electron is moving at any one moment. All we can know is a probability. There's no sufficient reason that guarantees where the electron pops out of existence and then pops into existence. And what we're recording when we see all the little dots appearing for the s orbital in a hydrogen atom are just the number of different places it popped into existence here and here and here and here. So what you're looking at in the electron cloud is just a probability diagram, just like the S-curve. It's very likely to occur here and less likely over here and over here. So not only does the electron pop in and out of existence in the atom, but according to quantum mechanics, according to the statistical laws that govern the electron, if you watch an empty region of space, you'll see a little bit of matter pop into existence from nowhere there. In fact, this little GIF here, if you watch the actual PowerPoint, you'll see a little GIF of empty space giving rise to matter-antimatter pairs. So quantum mechanics predicts, and we in fact can observe if we watch empty space, there are salt mines filled with water with all kinds of detectors trained on them, and they watch little bits of empty space to see little bits of matter popping into existence in accordance with the predictions of quantum mechanics. So the common ground here is that little bits of matter do appear to pop into existence from nowhere. It does appear that you get something from nothing, despite the fact that it may contradict our common sense. And more recent physicists have believed that perhaps the Big Bang theory that then gave rise to the entire universe was one of these quantum fluctuations. A little bit of matter popped into existence from nowhere, and the known universe expanded from that tiny little bit of matter. So quantum mechanics suggests that it is possible to get something from nothing, contrary to what St. Thomas says. And despite the fact that the principle of sufficient reason guides common sense with big objects, it doesn't apply to very, very small objects like the particles of quantum mechanics. So it's possible that the Big Bang arose from nothingness as one of these quantum singularities or quantum events, where a little bit of matter pops into existence from nowhere in accordance with the statistical laws of quantum mechanics. Albert Einstein, despite being one of the founders of quantum mechanics, never accepted this aspect of quantum mechanics. He very famously said, God does not play dice with the universe. So Einstein wondered whether there was another explanation of where it came from. Maybe the electron isn't just popping out of existence, popping into existence. Maybe it's going somewhere else. And maybe these little bits of matter that are popping into existence apparently from nowhere, maybe they really aren't coming from nowhere. They're coming from somewhere else that we can't detect. But more recent experiments have suggested that Einstein's alternative theory, the hidden variable theory, doesn't match the data that we're capable of getting. So most physicists agree with Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen interpretation that little bits of matter pop into existence from nowhere, and probability or chance is violations of sufficient reason are just part of the structure of the universe on this small quantum scale. So again, you have to decide what makes more sense, getting something from nothing, or having this other type of being, a necessary and eternal being. And David Hume, thinks that he has an argument against this third possibility of a necessary existence. He thinks that everything that we think of can be thought as either existing or not existing. Think of a cup, think of a teapot, think of a tree, think of a planet. We can imagine all of them existing or not existing without changing the essence of that thing. Whereas St. Anselm thought that existence made something better, affected its nature, that you'd rather have 50 existing dollars than $50 that only exist in your mind. Hume says that existence is not a perfection, that if you take 50 existing dollars and 50 non-existing dollars, there's still $50. There's not a non-existence discount. It doesn't become $49. So you can imagine anything as either existing or not existing, which means that you can imagine either God as either existing or not existing, and therefore you can't know that God exists necessarily. Whereas St. Thomas would just say that God is an exception to this common ground, that that's true for most things, but if you don't believe in a necessary and eternal being, then you won't be able to explain the existence of the universe. So you should note the logic of this argument. It works by process of elimination. St. Thomas has a very tough task. He has to prove that there's no scientific way, despite what mathematics and quantum mechanics say, there's no possible way there could be an infinite regress, and there's no possible way you could get something from nothing. Says he can prove by process of elimination that this idea of a necessary existence is the only possible way of explaining the universe. So, again, of those three possibilities, you have to ask yourself which of those three hurts your head the least. And remember, the structure of the argument is that in order to prove God's existence, you have to be able to definitively rule out those possibilities and then be left with this other possibility. Now, there are two other types of proofs that St. Thomas gives. And the fourth way, called the way from gradations of goodness, is actually more similar to another type of proof that people often give for the existence of God if they believe in God for some reason. Some people think that they've had experience of a certain type of beauty or awareness of the natural world or of love or holding their first child, that some of their experiences have been so profound and so deep. Something like the vibe theory that we talked about before, of you knowing that somebody loves you and you knowing that someone has unconditional love for you. That we have those types of experiences of the beauty in nature, looking at a sunset or seeing the sublime in nature. So the argument would be that there are types of experiences of beauty or of value, of goodness, that can't be explained scientifically and must have a supernatural cause, must be some type of feeling of the presence of the universe. In the same way that we might like to think that you could tell whether the person you're with is asleep or unconscious, because they make their presence felt, their soul makes its presence felt through their body, that the eyes are the window to the soul. So this is an argument that God makes his presence felt through the beauty of nature. So you might want to ask yourself, if God were to go on vacation, like in Bruce Almighty, if God were to fall asleep or go out of existence, would you be able to feel the difference? If all of the scientific facts about the universe remain the same, would the universe be dull? Would it all of a sudden go to black and white? Would it all of a sudden feel less beautiful? Would the life or vitality, the feeling of the universe be different if God didn't exist? And of course, if you say no, then God makes absolutely no difference to your existence. That's what the existentialists would say, that you don't know or feel its presence, that his presence comes from your choice, your leap of faith to believe that God exists. Whereas the traditional Christian would say that just as you can tell whether somebody loves you, so they think that you can feel God's presence in the natural world through beauty or some other type of religious experience. So we'll look forward to hearing what you think about these arguments during the debate.